Imagine if we could reconstruct our own stories, the historical record of our own lives, giving them our own spin. Frequently, we do just that as we tell and retell the stories of our family heritage. We may relate only the accounts of significance, the records of only famous members within our families. The books from Joshua to Kings are something like this. The stories were handed on generation after generation until finally, after an immediate crisis, someone or someones began to collect, retell, and solidify the tradition in order to explain how the people of God came to be in exile. Kathleen Farmer begins with this premise and leads us through the biblical narrative in which there is frank theological sensitivity to the failure of God's people to be faithful to their God.
The books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings tell the story of Israel's experiences in the land of Canaan from the time the people of Israel entered into the Promised Land until the time when they were forcibly removed from the land into exile in Babylon. Apparently, it was there in Babylon, in the midst of the national and religious devastation of the exile, that the priests, the prophets, and the historians of Israel put together their final version of this connected historical narrative that runs from the beginning of Joshua to the end of 2 Kings. In other words, when the historians began to look back on their people's past experiences in the land of Canaan, they already knew how their story would end. They already knew that the enterprise that began with such high hopes for success under the leadership of Joshua had come to a tragic end. The Babylonians had destroyed the city of Jerusalem, burned the temple of the Lord to the ground, and forced the political and religious leaders of Judah into exile in Babylon. So as Israel's historians gathered together the memories and records available to them, they knew that their version of Israel's history would need to answer an essential question for future generations. How did God's chosen people come to lose the land God promised them? The historians never blamed God for the loss of the land. They were sure that God had kept God's promises. In hindsight, it was clear to them that the promised land was lost because they and their ancestors had failed to keep the covenant that they had made with God. And so, looking back from the perspective of the exile, they produced an extended historical narrative based on the premise that the land was lost because we and our ancestors repeatedly sinned. And this narrative, which scholars often call the Deuteromistic history, reads more like a confession of sin than a celebration of Israel's past. From the perspective of the exile, the movement of Israel's faith looked like a steep downhill slide, with its high point resting on Joshua's leadership. So in the book of Joshua, the historians painted a word picture of what might have been if only Israel had remained strong, courageous, and obedient to God's commandments. They apparently believed, along with the writer of Hebrews 11, verse 30, that by faith the walls of Jericho fell. But they knew from the records and memories handed down to them that their ancestors had great difficulty in keeping their covenant promises. The historians tell us that the people who entered the Promised Land in Joshua's time were frequently warned of the absolute need for them to give their entire loyalty to God, the ultimate owner of the land. They tell us that Joshua repeatedly warned all Israel that if they were to have rest in the land, they would have to be very careful to love the Lord their God and keep all of the provisions of the covenant. In Joshua 23:16, they quote Joshua as saying, "If you transgress the covenant of the Lord your God and go and serve other gods, you shall perish quickly from the good land that he has given to you." So the book of Joshua ends on a high note, with all the tribes of Israel renewing their covenant with the Lord, promising faithfully to serve and obey the Lord and only the Lord. But as they evaluated the records available to them, Israel's historians apparently concluded that it didn't take the people very long to begin their downhill slide into idolatry. Less than a chapter and a half into the book of Judges, they tell us that the generation that grew up after the death of Joshua did not know the Lord or the work that the Lord had done for Israel. From then on, we see the entire period of history, from the death of Joshua to the beginning of David's reign, as an endless cycle, moving from sin to punishment and back again, with only brief periods of relief provided by the activities of the judges. When the historians remembered the traditional stories that had been handed down to them about the judges, those charismatic leaders who had periodically saved the people of Israel from oppression by enemy nations, they saw these stories through the theological conviction stated over and over again in the book of Judges. The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord allowed their enemies to oppress them. But when the Israelites cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer called a judge, who delivered them. And the land had rest for the lifetime of the judge. But as soon as the judge died, the Israelites again would do what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the cycle would begin all over again. The stories of Ehud, Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson probably began as separate and unrelated hero stories that circulated orally. The historians of Israel tied these stories together in a connected written narrative, separated from each other by these nearly identical theological summaries. The historians pictured the judges as military heroes, but they never considered them heroes of the faith. According to the historians, none of the judges attempted to lead Israel into a more faithful lifestyle. None of them tried to remind Israel of its covenant obligations. None of these charismatic leaders acted in totally admirable ways. The historians of Israel did not idealize these ancestors in the faith, and they did not gloss over the many ways in which they failed to live up to God's standards. And finally, in the last few chapters of Judges, the rising spiral of sin is said to spin totally out of control. The historians say the people of God and their religious leaders were involved in thievery, extortion, gang rape, murder, dismemberment, civil war, the taking of hostages, and genocide. You might wonder whether you're reading the Bible or the daily news. When the historians asked themselves, how could such things have happened in Israel, they concluded with the phrase that appears at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end of this sector of Judges. In those days, there was no king in Israel. People did what was right in their own eyes. Taken literally, this editorial comment refers to the lack of a human leader who would have had the authority to put an end to the anarchy that reigned in the absence of a king. The ideal king envisioned by Moses and the prophets and the historians of Israel would be one who both feared the Lord and used the provisions of the covenant to guide the nation in doing what was right in the sight of the Lord. In theory, at least, Kings were supposed to uphold and promote the doing of the will of God in the land. But the comment can also be understood figuratively, to refer to Israel's failure to acknowledge the rule of God among them. The historians confess that the horror of those days was due to the fact that people in Israel acknowledged no higher authority over themselves, no king, either divine or human. Thus, the last few chapters in Judges illustrate what happens in a society in which each person has become the sole standard of his or her morality. The stories included in Judges 19 to 21 stand as horrific examples of the evil that can reign supreme when God does not reign supreme.